thank you so much for coming along to the podcast again. So you were the first podcast that I did, which is the most popular one I've done. So
wow.
Well done, you.
Thank you.
And now I make the podcast and I also put things onto the YouTube channel as well. So we'll have the audio and we'll have the visuals. So for those of you who don't know Oliver is an awesome employment lawyer. He is one of the best that I've ever worked with. So I'm so chuffed that we get to spend time together and that you help me out whenever I need help. So thank you.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
And today we're going to have a chat about redundancy. So I think we both feel that with the way that the world is and the changes that are coming down the line, we may see more redundancies coming up. So actually it's useful to talk more about redundancy and kind of the key things that go with that. So first question then is kind of what is redundancy? What's the legal definition of a redundancy?
Okay, so redundancy happens in two ways. There's the classic thing where you say, I'm closing my business, or I'm cutting the size of my business. So I did need 20 employees, now I need 10. It can also happen because perhaps you're not necessarily shrinking your business, but you're reorganizing your business. So you say, I used to run my business like this, which meant I needed 5 people with these 5 skills. You might decide to reorganize your business so that the business hasn't shrunk and you still need 5 people, but you need 5 people with different skills. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
So you can come across situations where employees find it quite difficult because they say, well, hang on a minute, we don't need to save money. And the business says, no, I don't need to save money, but I need a different set of skills in my business now. That's a diminishing need for employees to carry out work of a particular kind. So it's still redundancy. You might even have scenarios where you say, I need more people, but I need fewer people like that. So the overall thing grows, but you still could have a redundancy situation.
So how, in that situation in particular, how do people make sure that they're making redundancies for a genuine and a real reason?
Well, they have to, it depends what the business wants to do. So the starting point, whenever a client comes to me and says, we're thinking of making redundancies, I would always have them write down what the rationale is, so what the business case is. And people often worry that employees can challenge the business case. Unless the business case is absurd, they can't. So the law recognises that businesses are free to run themselves as they wish. They're free to make business decisions. So if a business says, okay, we want to move in this direction, we want to abandon that product and shift our development onto this product, or we want to move from that site to this site, the business is able to make that decision and the employee can't challenge it. What the business then has to do is to consult about the consequences of the decision it's made. And that's a really key distinction. So if you're Vauxhall Cars and you make cars in Luton, the business can decide we want to shift production to Ellesmere Port or wherever. That means there are a whole load of people in Luton who are going to be redundant. You consult about the consequences of your decision, but you're not consulting about the fact that you've decided to move to Ellesmere Port.
So when we're talking about consultancy, or consulting, so for people who don't know what that means, what does that mean and what does that look like?
Consulting is an exchange of views after which the employer decides. So as you know, I do lots of training for ACAS, and one of the things that I'm always very direct about, which sometimes I think ACAS don't particularly like, is that consulting isn't negotiation. Consulting is an exchange of views between employer and employee with a view to reaching agreement, but you're not negotiating to see if you can reach an agreement. If I'm the employer, I give you my view, you give me yours, I listen carefully, and then I decide what to do. And that's consulting. So that business of we're not negotiating is really important, that we're exchanging views. It's obviously important employer goes into that with an open mind. So employer goes into it and says, this is what I'm proposing. Yeah, I've made my decision. We're doing this with our business. This is what I'm proposing the effect of that is on employees. Employee comes along, as I say, important for the business to go in with an open mind, and really important for the employee to engage in consultation. So quite often employees take the view, how dare you, I'm not going to say anything, I'll just sort of duck out of this whole process. That's a big mistake for an employee, because if an employee is looking to challenge redundancy later on, and they turn up and they say, well, you could have done this, you could have done that, I've got all these different ideas as to how you could have done things, the employer will legitimately say, why didn't you tell me? So from the employer's point of view, you go into consultation with an open mind. From the employee's point of view, go into consultation with a view to constructively engaging with your employer and telling them all about your ideas and ways in which you think they could do things differently. And then at the end of that process, the employer decides what they want to do.
So we started talking a little bit about important things. So are there kind of key things that employees should think about when they are thinking they need to make redundancies?
The strictly legal way to do it, the correct way to do it, is for the business to, as I say, to think about its business case. What are we trying to do and why? What do we want to do? And almost to think about that in isolation from the people, to think about what's right for the business. And then having established that, you would draw up your organisation chart saying, this is how I want the business to look. These are the roles I've got in the new business. So you almost do that in isolation without thinking about the people you've got. And then when you've got your business case, your org chart drawn up, you can start to look at how that maps onto the existing organisation, and you can start to think about, okay, A's job is replicated over here, B's job isn't. So you start to get a list of who's at risk and who's not at risk and all those sorts of things. So that starting point drives your whole process. And you have to be careful, because quite often your best people will be people who'll say, well, that's okay. If I'm made redundant, I'll be able to get a job down the road because I've got a great reputation and all the rest of it. So I have seen over the years a number of clients who end up entering into a redundancy exercise, and they lose all of the people that they want to keep, and they get left with some of the people that they wish had gone.
Yeah, I've been in that situation as well. I think particularly when you're offering really enhanced redundancy packages, and you've got people who are highly skilled, it's easy for them to take that money and then go off to a new role. But usually when you're making redundancies, you're hoping to kind of sustain your business. So if you lose all of the talent that you've got, it's just not helpful at all.
And you need to think about, again, there's a tendency for all the focus is on the people who are leaving and looking after the people who are leaving. By far the most important people are the people who are staying. Yeah. Because they're your future.
Completely agree. So there's a couple of phrases that you used there. So you talked about being at risk of redundancy. So again, for those people who don't know what that means, what does that term mean?
Okay, so you go through, you have groups of people in a redundancy. So someone who's at risk, let's say we've got 5 employees who do the same job, and only one of them is going to be made redundant. At the beginning, all 5 are at risk of redundancy, because you don't, it could be any one from those 5. So your at-risk pool is the 5 employees. Later on, one of those employees will be made redundant. So being placed at risk means you might be redundant. It doesn't mean you will be.
Okay. And with consultation, so I know you didn't mention it, but a phrase that comes up a lot is kind of meaningful consultation and making sure that process means something. What does that actually mean, and how do companies make sure that their consultation processes are meaningful?
Meaningful consultation means providing employees with enough clear information that they know what's going on. going into the consultation with an open mind, listening to what the employees have to say and considering it carefully. Not just rejecting it out of hand, but actually being prepared to take the time to listen, consider their answers, and then respond to them, again, clearly giving them information. So, too often, employers go in completely fixed, and they're not prepared to go, or they'll just be determined to knock out an employee's arguments. You don't know what an employee is going to say. Employee might come forward and say, well, I've got these skills that you didn't know about. Yeah, I did that before I came here. Or I'm willing to work part-time, or I'm willing to take a pay cut. There are all sorts of things that employees might come up with. So the employer needs to go in, as I say, giving them proper information and a proper opportunity to respond and to listen to their responses.
Fabulous. And one of my favourite questions that I'm going to ask you today, what are the biggest mistakes that you see companies making when it comes to redundancies? I've seen a hell of a lot in my career, but I can imagine you've seen much worse.
The biggest mistakes, redundancies. Let's start from the premise that the business has thought through why it's doing what it's going to do. So obviously, if you haven't thought through your business planning process properly at the beginning, that's a huge mistake. Let's assume that's been done. So you say, right, I've got the rationale, we're in the consultation exercise, and where does consultation go wrong? In my view, consultation goes wrong in two fundamental ways, two key ways. One, selection goes wrong, and you don't apply selection criteria fairly, or you don't score them properly, and if that happens, you end up selecting the wrong employees. So that's a big mistake, and it's an important mistake because the employee who's wrongly selected, if they challenge you, can say, if you'd done this properly, then I'd still be in employment. So they'll have a valuable claim. So that to me is the most important mistake that employers can make, and the most important thing to get right. The next area is that they won't conduct consultation properly. So they'll go into consultation with a closed mind, they won't listen to the employees' responses, that sort of thing. There are some process issues around that. Funnily enough, that doesn't matter so much, because if the employer's challenged, if the employer can say, yes, I got the process wrong, but the outcome was right, that will always limit the value of any claim from an employee. So problems with selection are more important, they're more damaging than problems with just the nuts and bolts of consultation. I don't know, didn't invite someone to have a rep at a meeting with them or something like that. Selection is the key one. And when you're drawing up selection criteria, thinking about what the criteria should be, when you're scoring those criteria, being reasonably transparent with the scoring. So the best way to do it might be, you've got 5 criteria, you score them all from 1 to 5, but on your scoring sheet, you're able to show to the employee, here's an example of what a 1 looks like, and here's an example of what a 5 looks like, so that the employee can actually look at how that scoring works. I would also say with scoring, I see lots of people coming out of redundancy exercises getting scores of kind of 0 and 1 and things like that. And employees always find that really difficult to swallow, because they'll say, but my appraisal says I was good. And the employer says, well, yeah, you were good. Well, then why have you given me a 1 or a 0? To me, unless the employee's been underperforming, their score should be, if we're out of 5, should be 3, 4, 5 kind of area. Now, They might still be selected because the best person will have 5s. But you want to be able to say to the person you're selecting, I'm not saying your performance is bad, I'm just saying your performance is not as good as theirs. And that's the difference. And people who try and exaggerate the scoring and you end up with employees getting 1s and 0s makes the employees really cross. It makes them feel like they've been underperforming when they haven't.
It just causes an extra issue for you,
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are the consequences of getting things wrong? And so there's key things to focus on and key mistakes, but if things do go wrong, what could employers potentially have to do or be faced with?
Unfair dismissal claims. It's the long and the short of it. There are some, the employment law consequences. If an employee is dismissed unfairly, an employee has a right to claim unfair dismissal. That can, their right to compensation, assuming they've been made redundant, so they will have had notice and they will have had a redundancy payment if they're entitled to it. Their right to compensation will be, in most cases, up to a year's basic salary. If a year's basic salary is more than around 90,000, then the cap on unfair dismissal compensation is around 90,000. Okay. If you're making multiple redundancies, then obviously you might have more than one claim. And one claim might be manageable. 10 claims becomes expensive. From the employee's perspective, of course, if one of them is unfair, if that person can say to their colleagues who have been made redundant, let's all join in one claim together, they make their costs overall lower, they share the costs, the risk to the employer goes up. So whenever you're dismissing people in multiples, obviously the risks are multiplied. I mean, it's obvious, but when you take into account costs and things like that, the costs can go up. I should add, Trish, all the things we've talked about, we're talking about fewer than 20 people. Okay, so more than 20, different rules, fixed consultation rules. I don't know whether you want to touch on that at the end or not, but
no, I can do, yeah.
But for the moment, let's just say we're making 19 or less redundant. Okay.
Okay. What about payments then? So we've started to talk about the money side of things. So when are people entitled to a redundancy payment, and how do redundancy payments work?
That's a question. Okay, so in simple terms, employees who have been employed with you for 2 years or more are entitled to a redundancy payment. There's a multiplier. I won't bore you with all of the fine details of it, right? But essentially, for each year of service up to the age of 40, 1 week's pay per year of service. For each year of service over the age of 41, 1.5 weeks pay. So if you had someone who was 50, who had been with you for 2 years, they'd get 2 times 1.5, so they'd get 3.
Not great at maths.
Okay.
But yes.
Okay, but someone who's been with you who's 35, 2 years gets 2, right? Now there is a period below an age in your early 20s where you only get half a week's pay per year. But again, let's not worry about that. There are calculation formula online. If you go onto the government's websites, you can find the redundancy payment calculator. A week's pay is capped. Cap's currently 591, I think, £591 per week. That will raise in April. It goes up every year. I suspect this year, with inflation running as it is, it might go up quite a lot. Certainly I would think it would go up to over £600 per week this year. So for someone who earns less than that, it's their actual weekly wage. For someone who earns more than that, it's capped at that level. That's a statutory redundancy formula. You do find companies who have enhanced redundancy formula. So sometimes the calculator will produce a much more generous outcome. And there are lots of ways you can do that. You can say, perhaps we'll use people's actual pay rather than their statutory capped pay. You might say we'll take the result and we'll times it by 2, or whatever. So there are lots of different ways that companies enhance redundancy payment schemes. If I were advising an employee, particularly one who worked for a larger, older established company, or one with unions or whatever, then they should always check whether there is an enhanced redundancy scheme in place, because that can make the difference between, getting a redundancy payment that's £15,000 to one that's £50,000 to £100,000, depending on what the scheme is.
And why is it related to age? So obviously there's also a lot of talk in the press and the media around age discrimination.
Yeah.
So why with redundancy is age included in that calculation?
I have no idea.
I love your honesty.
It should be. Redundancy payments are blatant direct age discrimination. Someone who is 60 gets a bigger redundancy payment than someone who's 40 with the same length of service. It's direct age discrimination. It used to be the case that if you were over 65, your redundancy entitlement stopped. That went. But it is still age discrimination. But the Equality Act has a specific exemption for redundancy payments, so you're entitled to calculate it that way. If you're an employer and you're looking at enhancing your redundancy payment scheme, you do need to be careful that at the heart of your new formula, you keep the statutory formula. So if you decide to enhance in a different way, but you keep age differentials in there, that could be age discrimination. So let me give you an example to try and explain that. If you had, if you said we'll use the statutory formula and we will double the result, that would be okay, because you're still using the statutory formula and you're just doubling the result. If you say we'll use the statutory formula but we'll remove the cap on a statutory week's pay, so that someone who earns £1,000 a week gets their redundancy pay calculated at £1,000 a week, that's still okay, because at its heart it's still the statutory formula. If you were to decide we'll use the statutory formula but we'll have a minimum payment of 3 months' pay for every employee, potentially that's discrimination, because you're not using the statutory formula anymore, because someone who's in their first 2 years still gets 3 months on our new formula. So you've moved away from the basic statutory redundancy payment calculation, and because of that, your new scheme might be discriminatory on the grounds of age, and then you'd have to justify it. So you'd have to justify, what's our legitimate aim? Is this a proportionate way of achieving a legitimate aim? And most redundancy schemes that you see that don't follow the formula are accepted to be legitimate. But you've got to think about that if you're going to move away from the statutory scheme.
I think it just reinforces the fact that if you get that planning stage right, it just permeates through to everything, right? So if we're planning all of the redundancy calculations and payments up front and the way it's going to work, it's just so much easier. Whereas when you're doing stuff on the fly, there's just so much more room for error, I've found anyway.
Absolutely. The process of this, the planning is the key, and working through what you're going to do and what your communication strategy is. All of that's important. And as I say, when you're going through the planning and you're thinking about communication, yes, of course you think about looking after the people who are going to leave, but really think about the people who are going to stay. Yeah, if you say to someone, if you've got a key employee and you say to them, I know I'm going to keep them, but I'm going to put them at risk of redundancy and I'm going to leave them to sweat for 4 weeks, there is a real possibility that person will say, well, I might lose my job, so I better go out and try and find another one. And then they find another one, and then you lose them.
Yeah. So we've started talking about more technical stuff, so I'm going to keep taking us down.
Okay.
So you mentioned how we were talking about 20 or less. So what happens when we get into larger realms?
Okay, so if you're talking about 20 or more at one establishment within 30 days, then within 90 days, then you're talking about fixed periods of consultation. And there is a process laid out in the legislation as to how consultation works, the election of representatives for consultation, the things you consult about, and so on and so forth. And if you don't follow that process, then potentially employees can get what's called a protective award. A protective award is up to 90 days of actual pay per employee. So that can be, if you're dealing with 50 people, 90 days is 3 months pay. That can hurt.
Yeah.
And protective award is unusual in that it's not so much about the damage that the employee suffers, it's more like a fine. So even if the breach is relatively minor, the award can be substantial. So the things to think about there are obviously the number. Secondly, at one establishment. So if you've got a business where you have multiple branches, there's this question of, is each branch a standalone establishment, or is the whole thing one enterprise? And it can make a big difference. If you're running a chain of fast food restaurants and you're making 40 employees redundant, one at each branch, then if all the branches are separate establishments, you never need to worry about collective consultation. Whereas if all of the branches form just one establishment, then you do need to worry. So you need to think about whether, say, you've got separate establishments or not. Generally, where things are on different sites, generally there'll be different establishments, but that's not always the case. You need to look at, how is management of the sites arranged? Do they have a shared HR function? Are they, one finance centre for the purposes of your accounts? Various things like that. So, you'd look at how far differentiated they are. But 20 or more at one establishment, then we're into collective consultation. I have lots of clients who try desperately to keep below 20. They see this as more than 20 is a problem, or 20 or more is a problem. So let's keep below 20. It's not that difficult, 20 or more. The process, and in a sense, the process is laid out for you in the legislation. It gives you a roadmap to follow. So going right back to the beginning, from the employer's point of view, the employer is best advised to think about what it wants to achieve and then to look at the consequences. And if the consequences are 15, fine. If the consequences are 21 employees, let's just deal with it, rather than trying to, let's keep 2 and sort of trying to massage this thing so that you end up with only 19 employees. Just accept it's 21 and follow statutory consultation.
I agree. What happens if an employee doesn't agree with their decision to be made redundant? What can an employee do?
Like any dismissal, it's funny. One of the things people say is, I haven't been dismissed, I've been made redundant. And I find myself sitting there going, but that means you've been dismissed. Redundancy is just a type of dismissal, isn't it? And like any other type of dismissal, an employee has a right of appeal. So they can appeal. The usual grounds on which an employee will appeal will be, you got selection wrong, or they'll say, well, I had all of these ideas and you didn't listen to me. If you had listened to me, actually you should have picked so and so instead of me, or we should talk about bumping. You should have bumped this person out, and I could do their job. Bumping is where, if, let's say someone comes to me and says, Oliver, you're redundant because we don't need very experienced employment lawyers anymore, I could say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll take the job of that middle ranking employment lawyer who's a bit less experienced than me, get rid of him or her, and I'll drop down into that role, and that other person gets bumped out of the organisation.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, but I always get a bit nervous with bumping.
Yeah,
and I call you.
Yeah, it's usually from an employee's perspective, it's quite a powerful thing to do, to offer, if they are prepared. I mean, obviously they're playing with fire a little bit because they've got to be prepared to accept the lower role and the reduction in salary and all of the things that might come with it and the reduction in status. But if they're prepared to do it, it's quite difficult for an employer to resist that sort of argument. Okay, so those are the grounds on which employees might appeal, and the employer has to consider their appeal, usual way, and decide whether or not to accept or reject the appeal. It's, if the employer's done its planning right, and it's been through its process carefully, and it's been through selection carefully, it's usually quite difficult for an employee to appeal. But it's not impossible. You see some selection exercises that are conducted very oddly.
Yes.
And when I'm working with clients, I would always encourage the HR people, for example, to press the managers who have done the scoring pretty hard as to why the scoring's been done as it has been. To really try that out. It doesn't have to be, scoring has to be reasonable. So two people might come up with different scores for the same employee. That's okay, provided they've each got a rationale for why. That's all right. But it's where you just have people saying, well, they're just I don't know, I'll give them a 3, and they've got no basis for that at all.
Yeah, I think there's conversations that I've had with managers where I challenge and say, why have you done that? And how are we going to explain that to ex-employee when they're sitting opposite us? And when they can't answer, that really gives me kind of concern.
Yeah, so I think you see that. I tell you the other thing that concerns me when I see those is people weighting selection criteria. I'm never a fan of weighting selection criteria, because again, it looks like you're trying to engineer a result. We've got all these criteria, everyone's roughly equal, so we'll take this last one about flexibility and we'll times it by 5 to produce all the differences. It just looks like you're cheating. I'd rather, if you're getting the wrong result on your selection criteria, that you rethink the criteria and add in or take away some criteria to produce, I don't want to say the result that you want, but you know what I mean, the result that perhaps you expect.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that planning piece, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah, it does.
Okay, another slightly difficult question, although it's not difficult for you. What happens if someone is off sick when a company is going through a redundancy process? What do they have to do?
I'd carry on.
Okay.
The employer's always a bit between the devil and the deep blue sea. In that there might be a pressing business need to carry out the reorganisation or to make the redundancies. If it decides to ignore the person who's off sick, when that person comes back to work, all the decisions have been made, the things have been done, they were never consulted about it. So, the person who's off will have a legitimate complaint, you didn't consult with me and you should have done. Obviously, if you go for consultation with them, you run the risk of them saying, but I'm sick. I'm whatever the illness is. So it's not easy, but my view is that it's usually better and it's usually fairer to involve the person who's absent in the consultation process. Bear in mind, most of the time they'll be sick for work. That doesn't mean that they're too sick to take part in consultation. Obviously that depends on the nature of the illness, but they may well be capable of taking part in consultation. You might need to adjust it. You might need to say, okay, well, don't come in and have a face-to-face meeting like this, but we can do this online, or we can do this through correspondence. You might need to be flexible about who's there as their companion to support them through the process. So, rather than just saying, well, it's got to be a union rep or it's got to be a work colleague, you might say, well, if it's a family member, that's fine, it doesn't matter. I would be flexible about that for the purposes of making the consultation happen. But I think, certainly if someone's off sick, I would try and engage them in the process. And you've also, it comes back to this question of being fair to everybody else. So you're going to, if you start consultation and people are put at risk, that will create a lot of uncertainty for a large group of people. And you have to question whether you're prepared to leave them all in limbo because you've got one person who either won't engage or perhaps can't engage or isn't willing to. And those are fine balances, but generally I would try and find a way of carrying on and engaging in consultation with the employee who's off sick.
And you touched on being able to do consultation online there. So is that something that employers can do, or do consultations all have to be face-to-face?
No, they can do them online if they want to. I'm a believer in face-to-face.
I know.
I think it's better.
Yeah.
I do think it's better. But most important is that consultation happens. So if it's the difference between no consultation at all or, well, we'll consult but we'll have this online, do it online. If you've got someone who says, well, I can't come online, okay, do the consultation in writing, do it by email exchanges or WhatsApp or Slack or whatever it is that you want to use. But the most important thing is that consultation happens rather than the forum. And that's where technology is great, isn't it? Is that we can get together, and you can have those quite difficult, what would have been a difficult meeting, simply because of the geography of it, you can make it happen now.
Slightly curveball of a question, and only because we were giggling about technology before we started recording. I logged into a Zoom call with somebody the other day, and they had an AI kind of bot or machine, I don't even know what you'd call it now, recording all of the notes on the Zoom call. What are your thoughts around kind of recording consultation meetings and how notes should be taken?
I think the golden rule with recording them, if you're going to record a meeting, everybody must know and everybody must agree to the fact that the meeting's being recorded. That's really important. So you should never make a recording without the other person knowing.
Yeah.
You'd be amazed how many employees record meetings. And I'm told a lot. I've got a recording of this, and I find myself thinking, that's great, but don't tell anyone. Or you'll see an employee's been through the notes and they'll say, I haven't made a recording, but I can tell you that at 8 minutes and 3 seconds Trish said this. So recording is common, but I would, first thing, if you're going to record a meeting, make sure everyone knows it's being recorded. My preference is not to record meetings, because quite often what happens is people say things because they think it sounds good on the recording. You'll have a freer and better conversation if it's not a verbatim record, and at the end of it, someone goes away and makes a minute of the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And the minute doesn't need to be hugely detailed. It needs to record the key points. So, lots of minutes should be 1 or 2 pages, not more than that, of bullet points really.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to say lots. There are some things that people always leave out of minutes. So I always like at the beginning or somewhere in there to say how long was the meeting. Because it gives a really good flavour of it. If you're going to say, if the employer says this was a very detailed consultation meeting and I listened really carefully, how long did it go on for? Well, it was 2 minutes. Yeah, it just doesn't wash. Whereas, flip that round, the employee says, well, they didn't listen and we didn't. Well, how long was the meeting? Well, it was an hour and a half. And you think, well, if it's an hour and a half long, you both said quite a lot. So things like put on there who was there, how long it was. If there were breaks, if someone got angry, that should all be, you should make notes of that. That should be minuted.
Yeah.
But then it should be a summary, and I still think that's the best way to do it.
Agree. I think that's all of my questions. Is there anything else that you think it would be useful to cover? I mean, I think we could talk about this for hours, couldn't we? That's the thing.
We could. Is there anything else to cover? No, I think the fundamental thing is that basic process. Do your plan. From your plan, you get your org chart. From your org chart, you get your selection criteria. And if you get that right, then all the other pieces of the jigsaw, the application of the selection criteria, the consultation, it all slots in, because you've got the selection criteria for example, might say, well, the selection criteria should just be the person specifications for the new jobs. And it's easy then to sit with the employee who says, well, why are these the selection criteria? To say, well, because that's what I need in that job. It's easy for the employee to see where the gaps are, where the vacancies are, what they might apply for, why they might be at risk, all of those things. So it's that process at the beginning which is really important. There are other things you can do in terms of designing your selection pools. So thinking about who fits where, that has an impact on the outcome, but it's all planning. And spending that time right at the start is important. And I suppose the last thing I would say is to make sure, if you're going to dismiss people by reason of redundancy, go right back to the beginning, make sure they are genuinely redundant. Quite often where dismissals go wrong, it's because you've got someone who should be dismissed on the grounds of their capability or performance, and the employer's trying to call it redundancy. Or they should be dismissed for misconduct, and the employer's trying to call it redundancy. That's always difficult, because then you haven't done any of the planning, you haven't done any of the justification. So getting that reason right and being straightforward about it at the beginning, probably a key takeaway.
I think that's a really critical point, because I've seen that so many times. And when it's not a valid reason to be making a redundancy, you just tie yourself in knots. So it's just easier to deal with what you've got in front of you than trying to make it into something that isn't.
Exactly.
Much easier.
Yeah.
Fab. Well, I hope that it's become increasingly apparent through this conversation that actually, if you don't know what you're doing with redundancies, you do really need to get some support and some advice. So I can help at TAP HR, but equally, it's really important that you get the right legal advice, and I would go to the best guy in the business. So how can people get hold of you if they want to contact you directly?
If they need to get hold of me, the best thing to do is drop me an email. That's oliver.pryke@cambridgeemploymentlaw.com. You can find me online, and my email's on there, my mobile's on there as well, so you give me a buzz if you need to.
And I will pop all of Oliver's details in the comments box below. So thank you to everyone who has listened. It's been lovely to have you, and hopefully you've been watching us as well on YouTube. As always, my standard disclaimer, the podcast is for general information only. If you do need to get legal advice, contact Oliver and he'll help you directly with that. Thanks very much, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thanks, bye-bye.